So thank you everyone for coming. First, to do a welcome, I'd like to invite xʷməthkwəy, who's a Squamish media artist, ethnobotanist, a land defender. She lives on the traditional lands and waters, working, learning, teaching, living, gathering medicines, creating art, and building communities. She was the 2018 Indigenous Storyteller in Residence at the Vancouver Public Library and was also a recipient of Vancouver Mayor's Arts Award for Film and New Media in 2010. Please invite xʷməthkwəy.
Sounds like I have my fan club at the back there. Woo! So, xʷməthkwəy Anhasqualowans, Anhasquəйл, Twaitztanat, Quiansnas, Twaitztanat is my traditional name, and welcome everybody for your good work tonight. I hope to make you feel welcome and welcome to shore and to our lands and waters of the Tsleil-Waututh, the Squamish, and the xʷməthkwəy. And then I'll give you back the mic, but just finish introducing. Just want to share a little bit about, I've been doing work with political prisoners for about 25 years. I've been involved in organizations like Joint Effort and worked with several different organizations over the years, and especially with Prison Justice Day. And you know, all that work has really come from listening to stories in the community, meeting prisoners that have spent the time for standing up for their beliefs. And I think it's tireless work, and I think that anything that any of us can do to support the work that happens in helping to free prisoners, especially political prisoners, but to work towards a better system, because this prisoner inmate system doesn't work. You know, like, we have to find ways to create safety in the world, but we are often looking at sending those who are creating safety into these prisons that basically are not really allowing that work to flow freely, and it just creates substreams of more work, which we all know. I know, looking around the room, I'm not preaching to the unconverted here. I'm sure you all have a lot of knowledge in your own rights about political prisoners and the work that it takes to free prisoners and to create solidarity links with them inside, to, you know, create systems like Joint Effort really did a lot of work going in and out of the women's prisons, especially to work hands-on with prisoners on their level, with their needs, and to bring their voices out, and to create programming that, you know, would create a better connection for them, not only with who they are individually, but into the outside world, and connecting them with communities that want to know about their work and to understand all that. So, you know, when I am asked to come to events like this, I'm not just like going, yeah, okay, Harsha, because I'm your friend, I'll show up. Like, I actually do this work too. I believe in the work. I believe that everything we do, even having events like this, helps to create more awareness, and it helps to link us in solidarity in our work, and it reminds us that we're not alone in the work that we do. And that, you know, we look at prisoners, there's so many worldwide, and I think even from the Indigenous worldview, so many, but one in particular we still have fought to free him is Leonard Peltier, and he's probably one of the first political prisoners I ever learned about, and that was almost 30 years ago, and he's still, you know, he's still doing his second life sentence, which was for a crime he never committed, and that was all staged, and everything that these agencies like CIA, CSIS, COINTELPRO, CIA, everything, they're all really just designed to create further oppression and to look for those champions in the community that change things. And the change makers often, despite the efforts of those agencies, become martyrs. And as we're looking at tonight, And, you know, for us, martyrs aren't people that are just sitting there in a memory, wasting time. Like the work that happens when we lose our comrades is the fuel for the next leg of that journey, and to see justice still come for those that fall. And from the activism I see in this city and across this country, in many diverse communities working together, justice does come around. It doesn't come overnight. It comes through this kind of work. So I just put my hands up to each and every one of you that dedicates that time in doing that work, because it is tireless, but it's not unnoticed. So I'm going to sing a song from my nation that we call the Siam Slolum, and this is a song that we sang to our leaders when we sent them onto the train when it arrived here, when it was built and arrived here in this place called Vancouver. And we sent our leaders across the country in a train and then on a ship to England to tell the Queen at the turn of the century, not this last one, but, you know, more than 100 years back, we said, we are never giving up these lands and waters. And that's why we are unceded lands and waters now, because we haven't signed treaties. There are 3 treaties in this province, and even what we've witnessed in the crimes that this government, whatever one is in power at the time, has gone through in pending in their own versions of those treaties, they still never serve our people. So that is why we haven't signed treaties. So I want to share Hope Hope Che. It's a song that lifts us up, and it reminds us that we're all working together. So xʷməthkwəy.
Thank you very much, Sis. So I'd like to welcome everyone to this event. I'd like to acknowledge that we're on the unceded Coast Salish territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. So for this event, we're blessed to have Sis here. We'll also have Josh Patterson from the BCCLA, LAMA MUGABO from Hogan Zali Society and the Alliance Against Displacement, Mercedes Eng, who is an award-winning author, and Yusuf Faqiri, who is the brother of Soleiman Faqiri, who was murdered in prison 2 years ago. So to begin, this event and the Justice for Soli movement is so incredibly important, and I think for that it's because it's part of a larger systemic problem and reflects the intrinsic violence of the prison system. And prisons maintain racial, economic, and social power structures that criminalize oppressed communities. Across Canada, the brutality of law enforcement and the overrepresentation of racialized and poor communities is not an aberration. Prisons are intended to disappear and warehouse certain targeted communities that are often marginalized and the most vulnerable. A large number of those incarcerated face undiagnosed mental health challenges or develop mental health concerns from the inhumane treatment while incarcerated, such as solitary confinement. Soleiman faced marginalization and vulnerability due to his mental health challenges, and he should have been protected and deserved medical support rather than dehumanizing conditions. People of color, particularly Black and Indigenous communities, are also disproportionately represented in prisons. In Canada, the Black community members are overrepresented in federal and provincial prisons by more than 300% compared to their representation in the national population, and Indigenous communities are overrepresented in prisons by over 500%. And this disparity is only increasing. The overrepresentation is even more dramatic with Indigenous youth and women. Indigenous youth make up only 8% of Canada's youth population, but 46% of all admissions to correctional services, which is 25% more than the previous decades. So it's been increasing exponentially. And the over-incarceration of Indigenous communities is a continuation of colonization by separating and destabilizing families and tearing people from their communities, land, and their culture. The detention of migrants is also an arm of the prison system in Canada. Most migrants in detention are in fact held in prisons, such as the Alouette Correctional Facility and the Fraser Regional Correctional Facility in Maple Ridge. And the UN Refugee Agency has criticized Canada in the past for holding migrants in provincial jails. That is a violation of international law, but nothing has changed. And since 2000, at least 17 people have died in immigration detention, either directly in custody of CBSA, the Canadian Border Services Agency, or while detained in provincial jails. And there are plans to build a migrant detention facility in Surrey, but detention, no matter what the building is simply the criminalization of migration. So Yusuf has begun his tour in Montreal and is continuing to speak in 6 different cities in Ontario and Nova Scotia in the coming weeks. And we're very lucky to have him, as well as everyone else on this incredible panel. I will give it to Josh. First, I would like to say that unfortunately, Josh potentially has to leave early for personal reasons that he needs to attend to. But Josh is the executive director of the BC Civil Liberties Association. Josh's career as a lawyer has focused on protecting some of the most marginalized people from human rights violations, civil liberties restrictions, discrimination, and environmental injustice. The BCCLA has been active in a number of cases, including recent litigation against the indefinite solitary confinement to support prisoners' rights and advocate prison justice reform. So please help me in welcoming Josh. You can use that microphone. You just have to switch it on the bottom.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Shireen. And thanks so much for the welcome. I'm really glad to be here tonight and recognize that we're on unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And our organization is one that uses the Crown's law, the law that's sitting on those unceded territories, the law that in BC, in these lands known as BC, doesn't actually have formal permission to be here. And so when I'm talking about the law and using the law, I am talking about the Crown's law, the imposed law, the colonial law, the system that is sitting here. But I want to recognize that by doing that, I'm not saying that the other laws, Indigenous laws, don't continue to persist on these territories. Thank you, Shireen, for pointing out that due to a bit of a family urgent situation, nothing bad, but something that's urgent, I may not be able to stay all the way till the end, and I apologize in advance. But BCCLA is staying here all the way to the end. My colleagues, Amy Gill and Iman Baubaid are here, and they should be here right through to the end. For me, it's really humbling to be with all of you tonight, to have been invited to come into this room and talk a little bit about the situation in prisons generally. I know we're going to be hearing later about a very particular, awful, tragic situation of Soleiman Faqiri. And part of the tragedy is that this is no surprise. This is not an unusual incident. The headlines seem shocking, but it's not an unusual incident. It's an entirely predictable and sadly fairly routine occurrence for someone to be killed by our prison system, provincially or federally. I'm not going to get into the details of that story, but because I know we're going to hear about it. But the features of that story, probably a lot of the folks in this room already know. Here was someone, Soleiman, who should not have been in prison, who didn't belong in prison. And the system knew it. The system knew it. This wasn't that folks didn't notice what was going on. This was his situation, his illness. The fact that he should not have been there was documented day after day, each day of the 11 days that he spent in the correctional facility, the super jail in Lindsay, Ontario. It is, he was suffering every single day before he was beaten to death. He should not have been in that prison. He should not have been in solitary confinement. He had already, in fact, been ordered out. But the system didn't comply. It didn't take action. And so instead of getting the treatment and the care that he so obviously needed, he was killed. And you know, as we'll hear, the police afterwards in the area said, "Oh, that was fine. There's nothing to see here. There was no crime committed." I'm sure we're going to hear tonight about how that investigation is now being reopened, and we'll see if another police department may come to a different conclusion. We don't know. But what I find, and it's sad that this has to happen, but in all of this tragedy, what I find so empowering about it is that the family is not just saying, okay, right? We're here tonight because Yusuf and the family are making nationwide efforts, not just for their fallen brother and son, but for everyone who's in there to shine a light on what's happening. And if government and the law aren't going to fix this problem on their own, they're taking the law into their hands, and they are trying to use it to force change, to force answers, even just to know. And so I really want to just recognize that effort, the depth of that effort, because it's not easy. It's very painful, and I really want to thank you, Yusuf, and through your family for the energy that you're pouring into this on everyone's behalf. Versions of this story have played themselves out over and over and over again across Canada at all levels of prisons. Ashley Smith in the federal prisons in Ontario, who took her life in Kitchener in a women's prison, where the system knew that she had problems, knew that she shouldn't be there. Guards watched as she died. Christopher Roy, who took his own life here in solitary confinement in British Columbia. Eddie Snowshoe, another person for whom solitary confinement wound up being a death sentence. Lucia Vega Jimenez, who was held for deportation at the immigration holding center underneath the airport and took her own life. In every single one of these situations, these are just a handful that I can just come up with instantly in my head. There are many more. The institutions knew that the people involved were having mental health issues, or having severe issues where they needed assessments, they needed different things to happen, they needed care instead of being caged, and that isn't what they got. None of those people got the help that they needed. All of them died. All of them were killed in a system that the courts have found is negligent. The case that the BCCLA and John Howard Society brought forward, so I'm sure many in this room who were following the news would have seen the headlines that the court found here in BC that the federal law, anyways, that authorizes this kind of stuff to happen is unconstitutional. Now, first of all, before I even talk about that, it's all great to commend the lawyers and the BCCLA and others for the win, but it was the prisoners and their families who won that case. Lawyers can make really cool arguments in court, but it's meaningless without those efforts. And significant efforts, great personal cost to bring those stories forward, to sit in front of the judge and get that guy to see in his own eyes, through their eyes, the inhumanity of the system. And they succeeded. They succeeded. And the court made a whole bunch of findings that different constitutional rights were violated, including discrimination against people with mental illness, discrimination against Indigenous people, and that fundamentally that the system took away people's lives. And he found a lot more. He found that there was, and this wasn't anything new, but it was the first time that a court had really said it, that these systems have a culture of breaking the law, a culture of non-compliance. And it was a resounding condemnation of the system. And there was another decision in Ontario too, and these are at the federal level. There's lots of other actions being taken provincially. And for me, what I find very angering about it is that despite the government in Ontario, by the way, had made commitments that they want to change the system. Indeed, they've written a new law to try and fix some of these things. And yet, they continue to fight the Faqiri family. The federal government that we have right now promised they were going to fix all of this stuff. And they got politics being politics, maybe that's something they weren't really that excited about doing. And here they're handed a court judgment saying you have to do it. So they've promised to do it, they're told they have to do it, and instead of creating real fixes, they continue to fight. They say, well, few bad apples, the law that allows all this to happen is fine, it's just that it's being misapplied. The law is just being misapplied. Just some guards making bad decisions. The court found that there was a culture, a decades-old culture, of just breaking the rules, of not complying. And not always by terrible people acting for evil, but in many cases by just regular people who aren't given the resources to make the right decisions, who don't, like the guards who don't have, in many instances, anything to do or anywhere to send someone who they observe as having a problem. The whole system is broken. If you were a good actor in the system, if someone of goodwill, you would have trouble doing good in a system that's this broken. And then, of course, you have people who are not, who are of ill will, people who are acting in cruelty. And so, the federal government has brought a new bill, and I'm very discouraged. They say, and they have press conferences saying that the harms of solitary confinement are going to come to an end. By the way, a system that puts people in boxes the size of maybe the footprint of a Volkswagen car, or if you have live in an apartment, maybe the bathroom in your apartment, maybe a little bit bigger than a small bathroom, and keeps them there for thousands of days. Forces any human contact that they have, which is often very little, to happen through a meal slot. Elders having to kneel outside the door, get on their knees, just so that they could look through and have eye contact with the person inside. They don't get to go most times, or a lot of times, to another room. I mean, they're stuck in these rooms, which sometimes are covered in feces, they're covered in bodily fluids. They're terrible places. And if you're not sick when you went in, they make you sick. They make you sick. And the scientific evidence is clear. Psychosis, major depression, hallucinations, paranoia, aggression, rage, loss of appetite, self-harm. suicidal behavior. The list goes on and on and on. So it's not even an issue of, oh, the people inside who need care aren't getting it. The system is creating people who need care, and they're not getting it. And they are dying. And so, you know, the government brings forward this new bill, and they say this is going to change. I am very, very skeptical, because until the culture of these institutions is fixed, you can make changes, you can put in some new rules. I mean, I won't get into this new federal bill, but it still permits people to be in cells for 22 to 24 hours a day without meaningful human contact. It still permits much of the awful things that happened that have been documented. And a few weeks ago, we were in Ottawa because all of a sudden the correctional service wanted to talk to stakeholder groups. It wasn't just us, there was a bunch of different groups around the country. And to hear the reluctance and the sense from some of those officials, how down they were, how put upon they were, how inconvenienced they were, how even these changes, the changes that we think are inadequate, that the government is making, the folks inside the prison and their leadership are like, oh, I don't know what they're doing. Whatever you read on paper, I just have so little confidence that it's actually going to mean meaningful change for people. And so I'm sorry I don't have a better message, but it is the efforts of people like Yusuf and his family, and his team of lawyers, Nader, and others who, you know, I think in Ontario and for this Lindsay prison, shining a light on it can make a real difference, because once people start to catch on, just maybe we won't allow our system to get away with this in the way that we have. So thank you. I won't take any more time.
Thank you, Josh. Next, we'll have LAMA MUGABO, who is a planner, researcher, and community organizer. He is a member of the Hogan Society and Alliance Against Displacements. The purposes of the Hogan Society is to advance the social, political, economic, and cultural well-being of people of African descent and Black people through the delivery of housing, built spaces, and culturally informed programming operations. Please help me in welcoming Lama.
Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this conversation. I want to thank Noe and for really fighting this battle and allowing Yusuf to come here and share the story. I think it's very critical that we remain in solidarity, but we can't do that without information, so public education is very crucial. So I'm really delighted to be here, and I bring you solidarity from Hogan Society, as well as Alliance Against Displacement, and my comrades from downtown East Side that have been fighting for social justice. And so we're here to stand in solidarity with Soleiman Faqiri family, and to make sure that the system is fixed, that this injustice cannot continue unchallenged. So it's very important to do this work, because we know that so many people continue to die unnecessarily. When those deaths are not properly investigated, and the family's questions continue to remain unanswered, our humanity is diminished. So we have to ask the question, and we have to hold the politicians accountable and hold their feet to the fire to make sure that this system is fixed. And thank you, Josh, for what you said, because I think it's very easy to look at the law and look at the amendment and say, we're good. But this law is only written. We have to push. And that's why the work of Alliance Against Displacement, pushing for social justice, the work that Hogan's Irish Society is doing to redress injustice that happened to black people in this city when the only black neighborhood was destroyed. Thank God, with the work that we've done, we can bring back this community. So why? Why was it that when the police was called to the scene, instead of taking Soleiman to the hospital, they knew very well he was mentally ill. They took him to this correction facility. Why why did the system take so long to answer the questions? And what would have happened had Fifth Estate not do the investigative report that really began to shine a light on the death of this innocent man? It says that according to a surveillance video, an internal report, Soleiman died after the guards at the provincial facility pepper sprayed and beat him. As a result of this vicious beating, Soleiman sustained 50 bruises and a blow to the head. His hands were bound behind his back when he was being pepper sprayed. He was then forced into handcuffs and leg shackles and returned to a cell in solitary confinement, which United Nations says that notes that it constitutes torture when prolonged and used against those suffering with mental health. So this is cover-up. It's cover-up. It's negligence. Someone slept behind the wheels. Someone made the wrong decision. And the system is trying to cover up instead of giving us the answers so that we can learn from the mistakes, so that innocent people don't continue to die unnecessarily. So it's not acceptable that crimes against people who are suffering from mental health, such as this one, are not heard in a court of law. It's critical that we learn from these mistakes, as I said, so that we can begin to allow people with mental health the dignity they deserve. Mental health illness is debilitating. In my work as a social justice advocate in the downtown east side, I see how poverty exacerbates people's mental health. When people lose their housing, their mental health begins to deteriorate. They worry about what they're going to sleep that night, what they're going to eat, they're going to be safe. So this is a constant battle. So what do? They self-medicate. And this really begins a cycle, spiral down. I talk to people. I remember this young man, we organized a lunch program where we wanted to bring people together and talk and find out what are the barriers for their happiness. And this is downtown east side, so we form an organization looking at people of African descent who live downtown east side and wanting to provide some help. And I met this young man who he was recovering from addictions. He's Muslim, so he was praying 5 times a day. He was talking to his imam, and he was really upbeat. He was working out, and so on and so forth. Then gradually, he fell back in. And he began to again use. And I tried to get a hold of him. I couldn't. And one day I was walking downtown, and he turned around, he saw me, he just had a pipe, and he looked at me and said, "Oh man, you caught me." I said, "I'm not gonna judge you." But he persisted, and then I got a Facebook message saying to me, "Hey man, I'm at a point of no return." And I tried to encourage him to hold on. 2 weeks later, he died. So this is what we live with when we have mental health and poverty. When you don't have adequate housing. When the cost of living continues to rise. And the only housing that you have access to is bought up by a developer who makes a little bit of transformation, and the price goes from $400 to $900. So we're pushing people to live with mental health without support. We're not solving the problem, and we're exacerbating the problem. Carnegie Community Action Project did research looking at the correlation between mental health and poverty. And it was very evident that when people don't have adequate housing, it becomes really difficult to make ends meet. And as I said, the mental health is exacerbated. We came across a research finding in UK that links national minimum wage to mental health improvement. Through statistics modeling, researchers found that a significant improvement in the overall level of mental health in those receiving national minimum wage, that it supports a claim that wage increase for low-paid workers reduce feelings of anxiety and depression partially, at least because they're under less financial strain. This is really troubling for people from the visible minority. I have a friend who has a son with schizophrenia, and she constantly worries about him. He's a big boy, 6'2", 250 pounds, so he looks a lot older than his age. And one time she saw him across the street, and he was playing with a toy gun. She raced and took the gun away, because you can imagine a black man holding a gun in public. She was afraid that someone will call the police and that would be the end of his life. And Vancouver is also known for police brutality and how the police treats people with mental health. What comes to mind is a story of Tony Du. Tony Du was a Vietnamese man with mental health. He'd been diagnosed with schizophrenia in his 20s and was talking to himself while waving a piece of 2x4 on an empty sidewalk. Seconds before the murder, what witness texts to a friend that Du's behavior was amusing. Based on a text, it's clear that Du presented no threat to the officers or anyone else in the area. According to one witness interview by CBC, talked about a police car pulled up and police started asking the men to come towards them across the crosswalk and to put down the stick. Right when they said put down the stick, they opened fire and killed him. His family never found out why he was killed. And I think this is really critical. We're trying to understand why are they protecting people who kill innocent people. So the system is rigged and we have to keep pushing. When we were talking to residents in the downtown east side and asked them what do they think of the system, what they think about mental health and poverty, what they think about the police, they said, police make my mental health worse. They're going out there, picking up people and harassing people on the street. So stories like that remind us that the police claims to serve and protect. They're not serving us. They're not protecting us. And we can't stand by and allow them to continue. We have to keep pushing. And these kinds of events, the work that Noe is doing, and the fact that you're here sharing your story with us is going to give us the ammunition we need to continue fighting. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lama. Next speaker we have is Mercedes. She is a teacher and an author, and her most recent work, Prison Industrial Complex Explodes, won the BC Book Prize. The impetus of Prison Industrial Complex Explodes was the discovery of a cache of her father's prison correspondence. Please help me in welcoming Mercedes.
I'd like to begin by saying that it's an honor to be included in this panel, and I am saddened by the occasion for it and the fact that there will be other talks like this. As a mixed-race person of Chinese migrant descent on one side and settler on the other, I need to acknowledge the territory on which we are, the unceded territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I first came to know the prison system through my father, who I started visiting in jail while I was still inside my mom. My dad was inside when I was born. He was there the first 2 years of my life. So for those first 2 years, we visited almost every weekend, both days, 8 hours a day. So that is 832 hours in a year times 2 years, meaning I have served almost 70 days' time by the time I was 2. So this is the context out of which I write this book, out of my experience of visiting my dad inside. And he didn't die in jail like Soleiman. He died of the system, regardless. This work of poetry, it uses a federal government questionnaire on the implementation of the Multicultural Act as a kind of structuring device for the poem. And apparently this federal questionnaire is distributed annually to all kinds of federal institutions, including carceral institutions. And ostensibly this idea that the state cares about implementing multicultural policy in various different institutions is great, but the reality is we know that the way that the government multiculturalizes the prison is to fill it with people of color. So as Josh and others have noted, the rate of incarceration of Indigenous women has increased by over 80% in the last 10 years. We also see that increase happening at the same time that the Indigenous youth population is the fastest growing in the nation. So certainly a correlation between those. I say that because a lot of the text that you're going to hear me read is not actually text that I have written. And I have attempted to engage with these texts to try to disrupt this benign language of multiculturalism, of therapy, of help rather than punishment or oppression. This year's annual report from the Office of the Correctional Investigator calls special attention to the increasing diversity and complexity of prison demographics. In the 10-year period between March 2003 and March 2013, the incarcerated population grew by an overall increase of 16.5%. During this period, the Indigenous incarcerated population increased overall by 46.4%. Federally sentenced Indigenous women inmates have increased by more than 80%. Visible minority groups behind bars have increased by almost 75%, while white inmates actually declined by 3%. When combined, the number of Indigenous and visible minority inmates now exceeds 6,000 of a total incarcerated population of approximately 15,000. In other words, 40% of the inmate population count on any given day now comes from a non-white background. If we look south of the border, we see the same. Section 1. Reflection of Canada's multicultural reality in federal institutions. Question 1.1. Does your institution's vision, mission, mandate, and/or priority statement include reference to multiculturalism? Earlier this fall, the federal government hired auditor Deloitte to examine various international jurisdictions that have utilized the private-public partnership model for correctional facilities. Canada is aiming to build its understanding of the various models, approaches, and experiences of P3 correctional facilities in a global context to determine their relevancy to the Canadian market. Of particular interest is the United States, which currently houses the largest prison population in the world and deploys its inmates as a captive labor force. Meanwhile, several private sector operators of detention facilities are working to land contracts to operate immigration detention centers, some of which are undergoing expansion. Question 1.2. Does your institution have programs related to multiculturalism? As a full-service corrections management provider, Corrections Corporation of America specializes in the design, construction, expansion, and management of prisons, jails, and detention centers, as well as inmate transportation services. We are the 5th largest corrections system in the nation. Since our inception, CCA has maintained its market leadership in private corrections, and the company joined the New York Stock Exchange in 1994. We are proud of the distinctions of having been named among America's best big companies by Forbes magazine and having been consistently named by GI Jobs magazine as top military-friendly employer. Question 1.3. Does your institution have reality television programs related to multiculturalism? The BC Civil Liberties Association says it plans to file a complaint against the Canada Border Services Agency for allowing a TV reality show to film travelers crossing Canada's border without their free and informed consent. The issue came to light after the CBSA followed a TV film crew from the show Border Security, Canada's Frontline, to film a raid on a construction site in Vancouver where immigration officials were looking for undocumented workers. This next text that I'm going to read is from an advertisement for a video game. It's distressing, although it's an advertisement. Prison Architect, the video game that lets you build and manage a maximum security prison. As the sun casts its morning rays on a beautiful patch of countryside, the clock starts ticking. You've got to crack on and build a holding cell to detain prisoners that are trundling towards your future prison on their yellow bus. As your workmen lay the last brick, you don't have a moment to let them rest as they need to get started on the first proper cell block so you can make room for the next prisoner intake. Once they've all got a place to lay their weary heads, the fun can really start. You'll need a canteen, infirmary, and a guard room. Oh, and don't forget to plumb the toilet or things will get messy. But what about a workout area? Or solitary confinement cells? Or an execution chamber? In 2003, a 14-year-old Indigenous girl named Ashley Smith was confined to a youth detention facility for 1 month after throwing crab apples at a postal employee. The initial 1-month sentence lasted almost 4 years, almost entirely in solitary confinement, until her death by self-strangulation in 2007. Though Smith was videotaped placing a ligature around her neck, guards did not enter the cell to intervene. And 45 minutes passed before she was pronounced dead. From mafia dons to power-crazed senators, Prison Architect has them all. A game, a training device, a service, a business. I'd just like to conclude by saying that Ashley and my dad both spent time at the Regional Psychiatric Center in Regina. My dad went there back in the 80s because it was difficult to get treatment for mental illness in the prison system. Of course, Ashley was there over 20 years later, and we can see that she didn't receive any help, nor did Soleiman. So what are we left with? Mentally ill, people of color in solitary confinement, dying.
Thank you very much, Mercedes. Our final speaker is Yusuf Faqiri, who is the brother of Soleiman Faqiri. Soleiman Faqiri, a 30-year-old Canadian Muslim, was struggling with mental health, was killed while incarcerated in Lindsay, Ontario in 2016. Solomon died after prison guards pepper sprayed and beat him. He sustained 50 bruises and a blow to the head. His hands were bound behind his back while being pepper sprayed. Solomon was then forced into cuffs and shackles and returned to solitary confinement. His family is advocating for justice for Soli, that is now a huge movement, and this speaking panel is part of a national speaking tour that's going to be continuing for the next couple weeks. So please help me in welcoming Yusuf.
Before I start, ladies and gentlemen, just wanted to ask everybody permission. We'll just be, if it's okay, if we can take pictures. We have on our social media. If anybody objects, please put up your hand. We'll just, if it's okay with you. Okay, thank you. And we're hoping to take a picture at the end of the event as a group, as we'll put on our social media. Respected friends, supporters, elders, I'm here to share the tragic story of Soleiman Faqiri. But the story of Soleiman is a much bigger tragic story that we're here to discuss. Soleiman's life mattered, just like Ashley Smith's life mattered, just like Edward Snowshoe's life mattered, a First Nations man who spent many, many days in solitary confinement. Just like Justin Saint-Amour, who was suffering from mental illness, whose life mattered, who died in the Ottawa jail, or the story of Cass Geddes, who was also suffering from mental illness. His story matters, who died in the Ottawa jail. Or the story of Matthew Hines, a young man who was suffering from seizures, who lost his life mercilessly at the hands of guards in the New Brunswick Penitentiary. The list is long, ladies and gentlemen, and the graves are far. But the pain of families continue every day. Mothers are crying all night, fathers are grieving, not knowing what could have happened to their loved one, while siblings continue to ask the question of, could they have done more? And so Soleiman's story is a story that we all have a stake in, a story that should be heard, so another mother does not bury their child, so another family does not go through the pain that my family is going through. And so I'm honored to speak in front of you, to be with my esteemed panelists, Josh, Lama, Mercedes, and a sincere thank you to No One is Illegal and the British Columbia Civil Liberties Association, because they get it. They get the importance of mental illness. They understand that this is a national conversation. Mental illness affects all of us from coast to coast, town to town, language to language, faith to faith. We all have a stake in. And so what I'm hoping to do, ladies and gentlemen, in the short time that I have this evening, is essentially this. The first part of the presentation will be Soleiman's life, who he was, what he represent. The second part will be the case itself, the circumstances of the case, and the final part will be the Justice for Soli movement. His life needs to be heard because, ladies and gentlemen, all too often, we make the mistake, sometimes consciously, sometimes subconsciously, of letting the illness define who we are. And as you'll know very quickly, very soon, Soleiman had many brilliance. He was a man with many gifts. And this is usually the hardest part for me, to speak out of everything, because after all, I loved him incredibly. And my family, a part of us was gone after that December 15, 2016 day. So I'll be talking about his life. So I start my presentations usually with two very important questions to start us into our discussion. And so I'm going to do that here this evening as well. How many people, if I can get a show of hands, have a family member or know someone close to them that's suffering from mental illness? How many people believe that people with mental illness should be in segregation? That's what I thought. That's what we all have a stake in this case. Who was Soleiman? What did he represent? What was his hopes and dreams? Soleiman can be described in in multiple ways, but summarily, he can be described as, as a man with intellect, his immense generosity, and ultimately his devotion to his faith and his family. So let's talk a little bit about who he was. Growing up in Pickering, Ontario, Pickering Ajax, which is a suburb just 35 minutes east of Toronto. He was the second of 5 kids. I was the oldest, the second of 5 kids that was born. And we originally were from Afghanistan. We came here at a very young age to Canada. So who was he? Growing up in high school, I was a man with incredible talent. In high school, he played both rugby and football. In addition, he was a straight A student. Being the oldest brother, it was actually me that looked up to him. I was always jealous. He would beat me in video games. He was the better soccer player. And, and he would rub it in front of my face, letting me know that, like, yeah, Yusuf, I got you. And even though he was younger than me. But there was this bond that we had, and he had this with all our family members. And you'll know quickly how that bond changed immensely after his illness. But it remained firm in the sense of the adversity they went through, but our family became closer. So what ended up happening after high school, he ended up getting enrolled and accepted into the University of Waterloo's environmental engineering program. And as we know, Waterloo has one of the most competitive engineering programs in the country, if not the world. It's a very competitive program. So he got in, and his life's trajectory was very linear, and everybody, my family, was very proud of him, and were expecting amazing things from him. And so what happened was, during his second semester in his first year in the spring 2005, Soleiman got into a car accident. And it was after this car accident that he was shortly diagnosed with the illness, as we know, as schizophrenia. But something even more profound happened after this illness, is that it was as a result of this illness that my family became closer. And Soleiman would serve as the gift to my family, as the gift of life. And he brought us together. And how did he do that? I'll explain. So after his illness, and remember, ladies and gentlemen, I talked about his intellect. So in addition to his native tongue, he spoke, native tongue was Farsi and English. He also ended up learning Arabic. And Arabic, people of the Islamic faith, we try to learn the language to be able to read our book, the Quran. And so what ended up happening was he learned this language. And imagine this, ladies and gentlemen, people that suffer from mental, they have an immensely difficult, road in terms of in terms of the ability to be able to really they have to go through things, but he was able to pick up Arabic. And so what he ended up doing was, he ended up picking up Arabic on his own, and he actually taught my mother how to read the Quran, how to read Arabic. And that's his legacy to my mother. And this is important, ladies and gentlemen, is that people who suffer from mental illness, we cannot let the illness define them. Rather, it is their character that defines them. And he, as a human being, as a man, with his brilliance, would remain steadfast. That would never change. And then something all of us can go tonight to think about is that one of the greatest things people can do with people that are suffering from mental illness is listening, not reacting, not judging. And that's what we did as a family. So to my mother, he was his teacher, her teacher. To my younger brother, he was a mentor, my youngest brother. To my other brother, he taught him how to drive. To me, he taught me how to pray. And that was Soleiman's legacy. And just a couple months before his death, he bought toys for my 2 nephews and nieces. He didn't have much in life, but he made the most with what he had. And what's remarkable is that we kept Soleiman alive with the love and the special care that my family gave him. We kept him alive for 11 years, yet it took the justice system 11 days for him to live his life. It took my family 11 years to keep Soleiman alive, yet it took the justice system 11 days for him to die under their care. So that was Soleiman, a man with brilliance, generosity, and ultimately his devotion to his faith. And ladies and gentlemen, if you want to learn more about him, there's cards and stuff we have. We have also our website, justiceforsoli.com. So there's more stuff about him, and it's also on our social media. But for the purpose of time, we'll go to the next section. So let's talk about the circumstances of his death. So let's go back to December 4th, 2016. It was on December 4th, 2016, where he was on remand, temporarily taken to custody at the Central East Correctional Center. Also in colloquial and more important terms, the Lindsay Super Jail, one of the most notorious jails in the province of Ontario and also in the country. And according to the Ontario Ombudsman, which is the organ of government that oversees complaints into jails, that jail for the year 2015-2016 was the most complained jail, and it still is one of the most complained jails in the province. So he's temporarily taken custody on December 4th. He loses his life on December 15th, 2016. Let's talk about these intervening 11 days, ladies and gentlemen. So my family, Lindsay is about 45 minutes east of Pickering Ajax. So my family tried to see him 4 times. We literally physically drove to Lindsay 4 times. My parents 3 times. Myself and my younger brother once. Yet every single time we were denied permission to see him. And one of the most difficult things to this day is we have not been told as to why we weren't able to see him. And the one time that I went and tried to see him with my younger brother, I told staff in the facility that Soleiman was suffering from mental illness. They were well aware of this, and that I told them, but in addition to the fact, remember, ladies and gentlemen, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia when he was 19. At this time, he was 30. So it's already well documented. But there's this addition to the fact that my family, I informed the jail that Soleiman was suffering from mental illness. But it's as if he was thrown in a dark hole to never be seen again. And I believe it was LAMA that talked about this. One of the most important factors with someone living a decent life with mental illness is family support. LAMA talked about dignity. And they took the one thing from him. And this is why we all as Canadians have to be alarmed. They took the one thing from him, and they took his dignity and his family support. They never allowed my family to see him. To this day, and that is so important. Family support is so important for somebody who's suffering from mental illness. But there's another layer to this tragedy as well. A few days before his death, and as Josh mentioned, the judge ordered for him to be transferred to Ontario Shores Centre for Mental Health, for a mental health assessment. Ontario Shores it's an area in Ontario where basically individuals that are suffering from mental illness some that are within the correctional system, they're to be transferred. That was a couple days before his death. And the only reason he wasn't transferred was because he was waiting for a bed. Imagine, ladies and gentlemen, you're suffering from mental illness, you don't see your family, and you lose your life in the very institution that's supposed to take care of you. And we as Canadians, we all have to be alarmed. We deserve better. Soleiman deserved better. Now, let's talk about that fateful December 15th day. And I warn everybody, there's some graphic content here. So, on December 15th, Soleiman loses his life. I remember that day very vividly. 2 police officers came to my family's house and they informed my father that Soleiman had passed. And that's when the nightmare began. It hasn't ended. My family continues to go through the pain every day. But let's talk about the December 15th day. So it was on that day, Soleiman loses his life, was killed under government care two investigations effectively started. So let's talk about these two investigations. One was by the coroner. The other one was the investigation by the local police investigating the local jail. Local police investigating the local jail, the Kawartha Lakes Police Service. Let's talk about the coroner's report. According to the coroner, at the time of his death, both Soleiman's legs and hands were tied. Multiple guards were involved in his death. He had a spit hood, and he was pepper sprayed twice. Those are the last few minutes of my late brother's life. And he was in segregation the whole time. And according to the coroner's report, Soleiman suffered from 50 blunt impact trauma bruises. 50. And all 50 were inflicted by the guards. None were inflicted by him. When we were washing his body, was when we were about to bury him, there was bruises throughout his body, a huge gash on his forehead. That was the violent end to his life that he endured. And he was 30 years old. So that's from the coroner's report. Now let's talk about the police investigation. The police, after a year-long investigation, sent an email to our lawyer, Nader Hassan, through an email, that there are no grounds for charges. There are no grounds for charges. As I was hearing Josh, what does that effectively mean? It effectively means that that's okay. That is okay. Well, no, ladies and gentlemen, that's not okay. No human being deserves to suffer what my brother went through. That is not okay. That is not okay, because people need to be held accountable and responsible for inflicting the pain and violence on someone who's vulnerable, on someone who needs help. And that's not okay for us as Canadians. But they said there are no grounds for charges. Now, we weren't told as to why charges were never pressed. And we were astonished, not just my family, not just our lawyers, but I spoke at a lot of events last year. People were shocked. Sometimes I often get the question from folks is, what country did this happen in? I respond, I said, right in our own backyard. Right in our own backyard. So, recently, an eyewitness came forward. Mr. John Thibault, and if folks have seen the Fifth Estate, I think if you can, you should see it. I do warn you, it's a graphic content, and I'm happy to share that, and give you the link after our conversation this evening. Mr. Thibault came forward, an eyewitness who was across Soleiman's cell, who says that one of the guards, he saw the guards beating Soleiman. As I'm paraphrasing, he said, they beat him. They viciously beat him to death. A couple other comments he made in this piece was, he saw one of the guards put his knee on Soleiman's neck. Another comment he made was, he said, as the guards were beating him, Soleiman tried to get up multiple times. And every time he was running for his life, he was running into the wall. Those are the last few minutes of Soleiman's life. Now, the question is, okay, if Mr. Thibault saw this, why weren't charges pressed? The Kawartha Lakes Police Service, police that did their investigation, did not interview the eyewitness. It was across the cell. How do you close the investigation without interviewing the eyewitness? How do you close the investigation without interviewing the eyewitness? Ladies and gentlemen, we have to be shocked. Ladies and gentlemen, we have to be disturbed. Ladies and gentlemen, we have to be disappointed. Because the reason my family is speaking out is because we do not want another family to go through what we're going through. We want this pain to stop. We have to stop this. And thankfully now, we're thankful to the Office of the Ontario Chief Coroner, who is now called a new police investigation to be led by the Ontario Provincial Police Force. There's now a re-investigation led by the Ontario Provincial Police Force. Make no mistake, ladies and gentlemen, this is an important step for us seeking accountability. But accountability is not to be negotiated. We deserve accountability. Canadians deserve accountability. And Soleiman deserves accountability. But this is an important step. The police investigation has recently started, the second investigation by the OPP. That's where we are in terms of the case. I'm happy to keep everybody posted, and you could also follow us on our social media. So that's the case where it is today. Now, let's turn our attention to the Justice for Soli movement, where I'm going to make my concluding remarks and about the movement. When Soleiman lost his life, the pain that my family went through, that we're still going through, it was immense. My family and I had a very difficult conversation, and we felt that we needed to speak out. We had to speak out in honor of Soleiman and in honor of the voiceless, in honor of the families that have lost other loved ones due to the justice system, the individuals that are suffering with mental illness. So we decided, after this conversation, myself and a couple friends decided to basically start the Justice for Soli movement. And the movement, and I'm humbled and honored to be speaking in front of you here across, in the other side of the country. It's an absolute honor. And so let me talk about the movement a little bit here. The movement essentially has two effective mandates that are intricately linked. The first part of the movement, the mandate, is that we want accountability on the guards who killed my brother for criminal charges to be pressed. Very simple, ladies and gentlemen. It's not like Soleiman just rolled over and died. He left us as a healthy man. He was given to us in a body bag. That's the first mandate. The second mandate, just as important, is to achieve accountability for Soleiman will save another family from losing their loved one. So those are our two mandates. So let's talk a little bit about some of the work that the movement has done. So we've held multiple vigils for Soleiman in downtown Toronto. Next week we'll be having a rally in Toronto as well with other families that will be speaking about other families that have lost their loved ones with mental illness. We've also have a research paper that the movement has published. Well, actually, before I say that, ladies and gentlemen, I just want to be clear here. Although you see my face in terms of the movement, there's many people behind the scenes from different occupational backgrounds and different backgrounds, because they get it, just like yourselves get it, with respect to the importance of mental illness. So we have an amazing team behind us. In addition to our lawyers, the movement is filled with individuals that are some from legal backgrounds, some from academic backgrounds, some are just students. Because they understand the importance of mental illness and in the justice system, that this problem needs to be fixed and that it is a national conversation. So our research paper was about 15 pages. We just published it recently. I'm happy to share that with everybody. We also have it on our website. We have a petition that has about 17,000 signatories. That petition is effectively saying that the individuals that killed Soleiman, for them to be held accountable. So would be very grateful for you folks. It's on change.org. I'm happy to give the link for you to sign. So that's our petition that we have. Our research paper, as I said, we'll be publishing a bigger one, about 60 to 70 pages in about a few months, but our 15-page one-pager is already done. We have a social media following, both on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I encourage all of you, ladies and gentlemen, to follow us. We do have, again, all the handles we'll give it to you at the end of the presentation. So I encourage you all to, if you want to keep updated on the case. So we have a social media following. We've done a couple of university and community tours. I spoke last year in front of the Ontario Human Rights Commissioner at Queen's Park, and spoke at several other universities last year. We have the Justice for Soli National Tour that we literally launched this week. I gave 2 talks in Montreal, one at McGill and one at Université de Montréal. And then yesterday we spoke at Victoria, and today I'm speaking in front of you folks in Vancouver, and then we're off to several cities later on. So that's some of the work we've done, ladies and gentlemen. In terms of how you can help, we're still trying to raise funds to cover our legal costs. It's quite a shocking matter when my brother was killed under government care, but we have to come up through the financial means to fight. Now imagine, so many other families. What about the single mother, or what about the First Nations? You know, and what about, you know, the recent immigrant, you know, or like certain people in the Black community? Like, imagine, like, you know, the difficulty. Like, if, you know, people do not have the means, you know, it's cost a lot legally, right? So, and but we're trying to raise funds. We have a you know, GoFundMe page, so we're raising funds for a legal case. So if folks you're able to, that would be great. Another way to help us, ladies and gentlemen, we have a letter to the Minister of Community Safety and Correctional Services, Sylvia Jones, for the provincial government. If you're able to sign it, it would be great. We have copies at the back. That's another way to help us. Another way to help us is volunteering with our campaign. We're still looking for volunteers, ladies and gentlemen. You know, you don't have to be in Ontario. We have our meetings are mobile. Commitment is 2 hours a week. And it's important to hear your perspectives, ladies and gentlemen. I said mental illness affects all of us from coast to coast, but there's also unique issues here in British Columbia that I think we need to have in the national conversation. So we'd be honored to have individuals you know, involved in our campaign here and out west, and also learning from you, right? Because we have to learn from each other. So that's another way to help us. And then finally, our petition, you know, at change.org. And if you get a chance tonight, ladies and gentlemen, if anybody has Twitter or anything, or Instagram, but on Twitter, if you can, when you follow us, or if you can tweet Justice for Soli, we'd be very grateful. So, as I started the presentation, talked about individuals' lives matter. I'm going to end it that way. Edward Snowshoe's life mattered. Ashley Smith's life mattered. Cass Geddes' life mattered. Justin Saint-Amour's life mattered. Abdurrahman Hassan's life mattered. Matthew Hines' life mattered. Moses Amick Beaver's life mattered. Pierre Corlien's life mattered. Their lives mattered because they were sons, they were daughters. They were human beings. They had hopes and dreams. Yet their lives were mercilessly cut short. And they all deserved better. Canadians deserve better. Just like Soleiman's life mattered. We must band together, ladies and gentlemen. Make sure another family does not bury their loved one. It can be ultimately between life and death. And I ended with this quote. The greatest measure of a society is how a society treats its most vulnerable. The greatest measure of a society is how a society treats its most vulnerable. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Yusuf. I'd like to, before I continue, show appreciation for everyone who's been speaking on the panel. So if we can show one more round of applause for all the speakers. So like Yusuf said, on the table outside the doors, there is a booth. On the table, there's 2 sign-up sheets, one to get information about the Justice for Soli movement, the other one for No One's Illegal. BCCLA also has their table. There's also a donation box to donate to the Justice for Soli movement, as well as a copy of the letter that Yusuf had mentioned, and also different pieces of information if you want to take with you about the social media for the movement. Can I look at your phone? I want to see what time it is. Okay, great. So we have a few minutes for questions and answers. If anyone has any questions for any of the speakers, that we can take that now.
Was Soleiman aware of his illness?
Yeah. Yes, he was.
Did he ask for, so he directly asked for help from the prison workers?
Well, that is the most, so that's a very good question.
Yeah.
We don't know what happened in those 11 days. You know, like literally, we weren't able to see him. So we don't even know what literally happened. We do know that he's dead on the 15th.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
No problem.
So, like Yusuf mentioned, we can take a picture, maybe in the front after we're all done. But there's snacks in the back, and there's a lot left. But thank you, everyone, for coming. I'd like to again thank all the speakers for sharing and for your incredible words and inspiration. So thank you, everyone, and have a good night.